In January 1997, a bank in Rockford, Illinois pulled the financing on a machine builder that had run continuously for 95 years. The doors closed within days, leaving workers on the street. By then, nearly 25,000 machines had gone out into the world, saws heavier than pickup trucks, lathes that carved a table leg in seconds, grinders the size of small houses. The company died almost overnight, but the machines refused to follow. This is the story, Mattison Machine Works. Welcome back to Trade Archive. If this is the kind of history you want more of, like this video and subscribe before we go any further. Now, back to where all of this begins. Wisconsin, at the close of the 19th century. Christen Mattison was a Norwegian immigrant machinist, and like a lot of men who came through the great European migrations of that era, he arrived in the American Midwest with a trade in his hands and not much else. He settled in Beloit, Wisconsin, a small industrial town on the Rock River, just above the Illinois state line. The timing of his arrival mattered because America in the 1890s was in the middle of a furniture and housing boom unlike anything the country had seen. Victorian houses demanded ornament, balusters on every staircase, spindles on every porch railing, turned legs on every table, and carved posts on every bed. And every single one of those parts had to be shaped by a craftsman standing at a hand lathe, guiding a chisel by eye, one piece at a time. A good turner could hold a pattern in his head all day, but no two spindles ever came out quite the same, and the work was slow, tiring, and expensive. Somewhere in every mill and furniture shop in America, a bottleneck stood at a lathe. Mattison looked at that bottleneck the way a machinist looks at everything, as a problem with a mechanical answer. In 1897, he patented what the trade would come to call the universal turning and variety machine. Instead of a man guiding a cutting tool freehand, the machine carried the workpiece past a set of shaped knives on a cam-driven carriage, duplicating a complex profile again and again with no variation and no fatigue. A spindle that took a skilled turner long minutes now came off in seconds, and the 10,000th part was identical to the first. For a shop owner, the arithmetic was irresistible. Around that invention, a company took shape. The business traces its name back to 1900, and by 1902 the C. Mattison Machine Works was formally established in Beloit. Over the years, it would trade under several names: Mattison Machine Company, Mattison Woodworking Machine Company, but the family and the product stayed constant, and it was never a one-man operation for long. The patent record tells you what kind of shop this was. In November 1903, Christen Mattison filed the application for his column and baluster turning machine. 2 years later, one of his own Beloit employees, a machinist named Axel Thorsby, patented an improved chuck for spindle turning machines and assigned it directly to the company. The ideas were coming off the shop floor, not just out of the front office. The early catalogs read like an inventory of the Victorian building trade: baluster machines, variety lathes, table leg machines, dado and grooving heads, ripping and edging saws. Mattison advertised in the American Carpenter and Builder and in the Canada Lumberman, selling to contractors, millwork houses, and furniture shops across the continent. The pitch was simple, and the pitch was true. Buy this machine, and the slowest step in your shop disappears. Then the airplane arrived, and the airplane was made of wood. Early airframes were built from Sitka spruce, ash, and mahogany, and nothing on them demanded more precision than the propeller. A propeller blade is an airfoil carved from laminated hardwood, and if two blades come out even slightly different, the whole spinning assembly shakes itself apart at speed. That is a duplication problem. And duplication was the one problem Mattison had already solved. When the First World War pulled American industry into aircraft production, Mattison was building a machine it called the Style C propeller shaping machine, and by November 1918, the company was advertising in Aerial Age, one of the leading aviation weeklies of the day. The same copying principle that turned out identical staircase balusters was now shaping identical propeller blanks and aircraft parts to exact dimensions, with no hand finishing required. The order books tell the story of those years better than any advertisement could. Mattison numbered its machines sequentially, one serial for every unit that left the plant. In 1913, the count stood at roughly 2,000. By 1920, it had nearly tripled, passing 5,700. The little Beloit shop had become a national machine builder, and it had outgrown its town. In 1918, Mattison closed the Beloit plant and moved the entire operation south across the state line to Rockford, Illinois, into a factory campus at 545 Blackhawk Park Avenue. On a map, it was a short move. In practice, it placed the company at the dead center of its own market. Rockford at that moment was the second largest furniture manufacturing city in America, behind only Grand Rapids. It was a town of chair factories, cabinet plants, knitting mills, and hardware works, fed by major rail lines and staffed by a deep pool of immigrant craftsmen, many of them Swedes with a reputation for exacting metalwork. In time, Rockford would call itself the machine tool capital of the world, and it was not entirely bragging. A builder of woodworking machinery could look out its own windows and see customers in every direction. Christen Mattison never saw what his company became there. He died in Beloit on the 1st of May, 1920, at 63 years old, just 2 years after the move. The business stayed in the family, and it stayed there for decades. Rockford city directories through the 1940s list C.L. Mattison as president, with a bench of Mattisons filling the officers' chairs behind him. The founder's name stayed on the door, the founder's patents stayed in the product line, and the founder's habit of overbuilding everything stayed in the iron. Through the 1920s, the Rockford plant ran at full stride, feeding a furniture industry that could not build fast enough for the American consumer. The company and the city grew into each other. Mattison men lived in the neighborhoods around the southeast side factory district, walked to work past the chair plants, and knew the men on the other shop floors by name. Which is why, on a Friday afternoon in September 1928, when the sky over southeast Rockford turned, what happened next was never a story about a neighboring business. It was personal. On September 14, 1928, in the middle of the afternoon shift, a tornado dropped out of a storm line and tore a 26-mile path across Rockford. The first thing it struck with full force was the Rockford Chair and Furniture Company's Plant B, a 3-story factory at the corner of Peoples Avenue and Kishwaukee Street, a short distance from the Mattison Works. Survivors described it coming in with the sound of a roaring train. The upper floors folded, the heavy rooftop water tank came down through the collapsing structure, and dozens of workers went down with it into the wreckage. George Palmer was a Mattison Machine Works employee, and he was one of the very first men to reach the destroyed chair factory. What he found was a hill of shattered timber and brick, with men trapped alive inside it, their voices coming up through the debris. Palmer grabbed an axe and started chopping his way in. Before the police and fire crews had even organized, he had cut through to 3 trapped men and pulled each of them out alive. He was not alone for long. One survivor, a worker named Jorgensen, dug himself free of the rubble and, instead of walking away, turned around and joined the rescue. Within hours, more than 200 men were working the pile, and they worked it for 2 days straight. Not everyone came out. 8 workers died at Plant B. Among them were Olaf Larsen, 27 years old, Martin Anderson, 34, Frank Strom, also 34, Herman Weidel, 47, August Peterson, 52, and Gunnar Ryden, who was killed at the plant on his 29th birthday. Across Rockford, The storm took 14 lives in all and injured well over 100 people. Weather historians still rank it among the most violent storms in the city's history. For 2 days, the corner of Peoples and Kishwaukee was the center of the city. Machinists, molders, and furniture men worked the wreckage in shifts alongside the police and fire crews, hauling away timber by hand and listening between loads for voices. The men being dug out were not strangers. They were neighbors, church members, brothers-in-law, the same faces from the streetcar and the lunch counter. When the last body came out of Plant B, the factory district went back to work because in 1928 there was nothing else to do. But nobody who stood on that pile forgot it. There is no plaque for George Palmer at the corner of Peoples and Kishwaukee. His name survives in the historical accounts of that afternoon and almost nowhere else. A machinist heard a factory come down, picked up an axe, and went in. But if you want to understand what companies like Mattison actually were in a city like Rockford, that afternoon is the clearest picture you will ever find. These factories were the load-bearing walls of a community, and when one of them fell, men from the others came running. That community built machines the way it rebuilt itself, with more material than strictly necessary and more patience than the market demanded. And the heart of it was the foundry. Mattison poured its own iron. Inside the Rockford campus, the company ran its own foundry, and the process began before any metal ever melted, in the pattern shop, where pattern makers built full-scale wooden replicas of every bed, column, and table, oversized by a precise allowance to account for the iron shrinking as it cooled. Those patterns were pressed into molds of green sand, a damp mixture of sand, clay, and water packed into flasks by hand, and into those cavities the foundry crews poured the enormous castings that every Mattison machine was built upon. That decision, keeping the metallurgy in-house rather than buying castings on the open market, shaped everything the company became. Because in machine tools, the casting is the machine. Every bearing, spindle, and slide bolts to that iron, and if the iron moves, nothing built on it can ever be trusted again. And raw castings want to move. Locked inside every fresh pore are internal stresses left over from uneven cooling, and if you machine a casting too soon, those stresses release slowly over the years and pull your precision surfaces out of true. The classic remedy, the one premium builders of the era swore by, was seasoning. You take the raw casting, set it out in the factory yard, and leave it. Through summers and winters, sometimes for months on end, the iron slowly relaxes until it has nothing left to give up. Only then does it go to the machine shop. It is the least efficient practice imaginable, whole acres of iron doing nothing but sitting in the weather, and it is precisely why a Mattison bed machined in 1950 can still be flat today. The trade histories of the industry recorded that Mattison machines were distinguished by their solid construction, by the precision of their machining, and by what one standard reference called the high quality of their castings. Behind that reputation was handwork of a kind that barely exists anymore. Ways and mating surfaces were finished by scraping. A craftsman with a hand scraper and a smear of marking compound would spot two surfaces together, shave off the high points a fraction of a thousandth of an inch at a time, and repeat the cycle for hours until the parts mated across their entire area. Cutter heads for the shaping lathes were ground by hand and balanced twice, statically and then harmonically, before they were ever allowed to spin at full speed. And when a machine was finally assembled, it did not simply roll out the door. Surviving Mattison final inspection reports carry the personal signature of the assembly floor superintendent. A man put his own name on every machine that shipped. Hold on to that detail. It comes back at the very end of this story. So what did all of that iron and patience actually buy? Ask anyone who ran the machines. Start with the one they still argue about, the Mattison 202. The 202 was a straight-line rip saw, and to understand why grown machinists get sentimental about a saw, you have to understand the problem it erased. When you glue boards edge to edge into a solid panel, a tabletop, a door core, a cabinet side, the edges have to be dead straight, or the glue joint fails. For generations, the trade did it in 2 steps. Rip the board on a saw, then carry it to a jointer and flatten the sawn edge. The 202 collapsed that into one pass. A precision-machined feed chain running in a heavy cast-iron track carried the board dead straight beneath an overhead arbor, and the edge that came off the saw went directly to the glue clamps. The trade called it a glue line rip, and the machine that delivered it was built like a bank vault. 6,500 pounds on a footprint of 77 by 65 inches. A 15-horsepower arbor motor spinning a 14-inch blade at 3,400 revolutions per minute, with a separate 2-horsepower motor driving the feed at 4 speeds, pushing lumber through the cut at up to 168 feet per minute. Careful operators even learned to tune the track to cut a microscopic hollow along the edge, so the ends of a glued panel would clamp up just slightly tighter than the middle. On the forums where old machinery men gather, the verdict on the 202 has barely wavered in 50 years. Best straight-line rip ever built. Then there were the automatic shaping lathes, the direct descendants of Christen's 1897 patent. Models like the 55C and the 57D carried a heavy rotating cutterhead cylinder studded with dozens of individual knives, each one set at its own angle, pitch, and depth. Setting one up was a craft in itself. Hours of mounting, gauging, and balancing on a specialized stand, because an unbalanced head at speed will shake a machine to pieces. The men who could set a Mattison lathe were a small guild within the trade, and plants guarded them accordingly, since a well-tuned head was worth more per shift than nearly anyone else on the floor. But once dialed in, the output was almost unreasonable. A square hardwood blank went in, the carriage fed it against the spinning knives, and in a matter of seconds, in a storm of wood chips, out came a finished table leg or a bedpost. Then another, each one interchangeable with the last, hour after hour, shift after shift. Entire American furniture lines were built on the backs of these lathes. Rounding out the woodworking catalog were the molders, machines like the four-head models 228 and 229 that cut a finished profile, crown molding, casing, flooring, on multiple faces of a board in a single pass. Mattison molders spun heavy custom ground heads at thousands of revolutions per minute, and operators kept them cutting perfect circles with jointing stones, small abrasives lowered onto the knives while the head was running, honing every edge to an identical cutting path. All that spinning steel generates violence, and this is where the seasoned iron earned its keep. The sheer mass of the base swallowed the vibration, and the wood came off the outfeed table with a finish so clean it barely needed sanding. In big production plants, these machines ran around the clock, and their downtime records became the stuff of trade journal write-ups. By the Second World War, however, Mattison was no longer just a woodworking house. Somewhere along the way, the company had crossed into an entirely different industry, and it happened because of a rivalry. Back in 1909, the Blanchard Machine Company of Massachusetts had introduced the vertical spindle rotary surface grinder, a machine that spun heavy steel parts on a rotating magnetic table beneath a grinding wheel, hogging metal flat at production speed. Blanchard's success created a market, and Mattison walked into it. First with rotary grinders of its own. Then, with the machines that would define its second empire of iron, the big horizontal spindle reciprocating grinders. Long hydraulic tables gliding back and forth on hand-scraped ways beneath a grinding wheel, capable of bringing enormous steel surfaces flat and parallel to within 1/1000th of an inch. The two companies split the trade so completely that their names stopped being brands and became nouns. To this day, on American shop floors, a rotary grinder is a Blanchard and a big reciprocating grinder is a Mattison, no matter whose nameplate is bolted to it. There are worse forms of immortality. The war put all of it to work. Grinders are how you make armor plate flat, how you finish the mating faces of engine components, how you build the dies that stamp out everything else. A tank, a bomber, a destroyer. Every one of them begins with steel ground flat and parallel somewhere far behind the lines, and the machines that do that grinding have to exist before anything else can. Between 1941 and 1945, Mattison's serial numbers jumped by more than 2,000 machines. It was the fastest output in the company's history, the Rockford plant running around the clock for the war effort. And when the war ended, the boom did not. Post-war America was furnishing new houses by the million and stamping steel into cars and appliances as fast as the mills could roll it. And both halves of the Mattison catalog, the woodworking line and the grinder line, sold on every continent, from European rebuilding programs to South American furniture plants. These were the years that built Rockford's middle class. A man could hire on at the foundry out of high school, apprentice into the machine shop, buy a house within walking distance of the plant, and retire from the same address 40 years later, and thousands did. The Mattison payroll built its share of that city. But inside the plant, the post-war years brought a different kind of fight. Organized labor was sweeping through the Midwestern factory belt. The Wagner Act had given industrial workers the legal machinery to organize. The war had given them leverage, and by the 1950s, the union drives were rolling through Rockford's machine shops, one after another. In the late 1950s, the wave reached Black Hawk Park Avenue, and Mattison's workers voted in a union election supervised by the National Labor Relations Board. Management did not accept the result. The company refused to bargain, and its lawyers went looking for a way to undo the election. What they found was almost absurd. On the board's official election notices, the company's corporate name had been misspelled, a typo. On that basis, Mattison argued that the entire election was invalid. And here is the remarkable part. It worked. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals sided with the company and refused to enforce the board's order, holding the government to the letter of its own paperwork. The workers had voted, the vote had been certified, and a spelling mistake had erased it. The board appealed, and the dispute over a misspelled name went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. The case was argued on January 9, 1961. 2 weeks later, on January 23, the court handed down its answer, unanimous and unsigned, in NLRB versus Mattison Machine Works. The justices called the lower court's ruling plain error. A minor and unconfusing mistake in a company's name, they held, could not be used to overturn the expressed will of the workforce, and trivial slips of administrative procedure were no grounds for throwing out an otherwise valid order. The company that had spent years fighting its own employees over a typo was ordered by the highest court in the country to sit down and bargain. It is a strange entry in the company's ledger. Mattison built machines with a generosity that bordered on excess, and it fought its workers' union down to the last technicality, and both of those facts are true at once. The men who poured the iron and scraped the ways got their seat at the table because 9 justices in Washington decided a spelling mistake was not a loophole. The case still sits in the law books, cited whenever someone tries to overturn an election on a formality. Which means a Rockford machine shop quietly helped shape American labor law, along with everything else it shaped. Through it all, the grinder business kept compounding. In the late 1950s, Hanchett Manufacturing of Big Rapids, Illinois, the firm behind the Magna Lock line of electromagnetic chucks, sold its rotary grinder product line to Mattison, and the two companies settled into a partnership that would run for decades. Nearly every Mattison grinder shipped with a Magnalock chuck built into its table, a bed of electromagnets that clamped heavy steel workpieces down flat with no mechanical fixtures in the wheel's way. Many customers never realized the chuck under their work was technically another company's product. In 1985, Mattison made the marriage official and bought the Magnalock work-holding lines outright, moving them to Rockford, and the machines kept growing. In 1977, Mattison advertised a rotary grinder it called the Big Swinger, a magnetic chuck 10 feet across, 12 feet of swing, 300 horsepower on the spindle. By 1981, the company's running serial count had passed 24,000 machines. 8 decades of records, patents, castings, and signatures, and the count was still climbing. It would climb about 400 more. The 1980s hit the American machine tool industry like a rolling barrage. A brutal recession at the start of the decade gutted the steel industry that bought Mattison's biggest grinders. Heavy manufacturing began moving offshore, and with it went the orders for massive new domestic machine tools. At the same time, the ground under the industry shifted. Computer numerical control was rewriting what a machine tool even was, replacing hydraulics and relay logic with servo motors and software, and retooling for that world took research money and capital that aging Midwestern builders no longer had. Mattison did try to adapt. The company brought out microprocessor-controlled shaping lathes it branded the Matty Max, bolting modern electronics onto the descendants of Christen's 1897 patent. But a control panel on a legacy machine was a patch, and the patch was competing against builders who had designed for the electronic age from a clean sheet of paper. On the woodworking side, the threat came by container ship. European builders like SCM and Weinig, along with a growing wave of Asian manufacturers, were selling lighter, cheaper machines with modern electronic controls. A furniture plant running on thin margins could buy one, run it hard, and replace it, and the math worked. Mattison's entire identity was the opposite bet. Build it once, build it forever. In a market that had learned to treat machines as consumables, forever stopped being a selling point. And there is a bitter irony buried in those years. Mattison's fiercest competitor was arguably Mattison. Any plant that needed a straight-line rip could find a 40-year-old 202 on the used market, still dead accurate, for a fraction of the price of a new one. The company had spent 8 decades building an argument against its own order book. The serial numbers tell you how it ended. From roughly 24,250 in 1981 to 24,662 by 1994. 400 machines in 13 years, from a plant that had once shipped that many during a single wartime quarter. The end, when it finally came, did not come from Stuttgart or Tokyo. It came from a bank across town. In January 1997, Amcor Bank, the company's lender, pulled the financing and shut the business down. After roughly 95 years of continuous operation, Mattison closed its doors within days, and the remains, the name, the prints, the parts business, were sold to DeVlieg Bullard, a holding company that collected distressed machine tool brands and kept a parts and service operation running in Rockford for a while afterward. There was no long goodbye and no orderly wind-down. Men who had spent 30 years scraping ways and balancing cutter heads, who could diagnose a grinder by the sound it made, were simply out of a job, and the skills they carried had taken a working lifetime to build and could not be advertised for in a newspaper. Generations of accumulated craft stood in the parking lot on Black Hawk Park Avenue with nowhere to report on Monday. Remember the assembly floor superintendent whose signature went onto every final inspection report? His son, Doug Lindell, went on to work in the Rockford grinding industry himself, and decades later, he still described the closure the way you describe a death in the family. Sad news, he called it. And then he said the thing that everyone who ever ran these machines eventually says. They were built tough, and they were built to last the ages. That toughness turned out to be the workforce's severance package. The shutdown was so abrupt that the deepest asset Mattison had, the knowledge in its people's hands, walked out the door unclaimed, and Rockford's industry absorbed it almost immediately. C&B Machinery, a grinding machine builder, hired the suddenly available Mattison engineers and stood up an entire division around remanufacturing Mattison disc grinders, stripping the old machines down to their bare seasoned castings and rebuilding them with servo-driven ball screws in place of the old hydraulics. The logic behind it is pure Rockford pragmatism. The half-century-old iron is better than anything a customer could afford to commission new, so you keep the iron and replace everything that wears. 21st century controls riding on 20th century castings, and the combination holds tolerances the original builders never dreamed of. In 2004, another Rockford firm, Bourne & Koch, acquired the Mattison line and became its official manufacturer of record, holding every drawing, manual, and schematic, and it still supplies parts and full rebuilds today. The Magnalock chuck business passed through other hands and lives on Under Obsidian Manufacturing, also in Rockford. The company shattered, and every shard landed within a few miles of the old plant, still working. And Amcor Bank, the lender that pulled the plug? In April 2010, federal regulators seized it. The bank that killed a 95-year-old machine builder failed 13 years later. The machines outlived them both. Because walk into the right buildings today, and Mattison is not history. At PGI Steel, a Mattison 400S reciprocating grinder rebuilt around a 415 horsepower motor on a table 4 feet wide and nearly 17 feet long, still step grinds steel plates 20 feet in length and holds them flat within a thousandth of an inch. At Wood Products plants like Highland Manor, Mattison rotary lathes are still turning furniture legs, their cutter heads still ground and balanced by hand the old way. And in small millwork shops across the country, restorers pull rusted 202s and old molders out of dead factories, sandblast the iron, press in new bearings, and put 70-year-old machines back into daily production, trading manuals and photographs on archive sites dedicated to keeping the name alive. These are not collectors preserving museum pieces. They are working tradesmen who hunt down a machine older than their fathers because nothing built since will hold a straighter line. And in boutique millwork shops, owning a Mattison has become a quiet badge of honor, proof that the shop takes the work seriously. Iron of that quality is now so expensive to pour that the old carcasses are worth rescuing for their castings alone. So here is the verdict on Mattison Machine Works. As a business, it failed. It misread the turn of the century it helped build, it fought its own workers over a typo all the way to the Supreme Court, and it died owing money to a bank that barely outlasted it. But a company is a legal fiction, and Mattison's real output was never the corporation. It was the iron. Nearly everything about American manufacturing has proven temporary. Mattison built the exception. If this is your kind of history, size.